Long before Roger Patterson ever loaded a rented movie camera onto a pack horse, before Bluff Creek had a name anyone outside Del Norte County would recognize, something walked across Asia on two legs, stood somewhere between 8 and 10 feet tall, and left behind almost nothing except its teeth. Paleontologists call it Gigantopithecus blacki, the largest ape known to have ever existed, a creature that lived across what is now southern China for the better part of 2 million years before vanishing sometime around 300,000 years ago, right around the period when early populations of Homo erectus and later Homo sapiens were spreading through the same forests it called home. Nobody has ever found a Gigantopithecus skull. Nobody has ever found a Gigantopithecus skeleton. Everything scientists know about this animal, its probable size, its diet, its likely upright or knuckle-walking posture, has been reconstructed from a small number of massive jawbones and a scattering of teeth, some of them turned up decades ago in Chinese apothecary shops, sold as dragon bones, to be ground into traditional medicine, long before anyone realized what they actually were. It's one of the strangest gaps in the entire fossil record, proof, beyond doubt, that an enormous, upright, capable ape walked the earth in the recent geological past, and almost no physical trace of what it actually looked like. Some researchers, most prominently the anthropologist Grover Krantz in the latter half of the 20th century, floated the idea that a relic population of something like Gigantopithecus might have survived far longer than the fossil record currently shows, tucked away in remote forest, and that folk traditions describing enormous, hair-covered, upright walking creatures scattered across cultures worldwide might be distant cultural memory of exactly that kind of animal. That hypothesis has never been validated, and most primatologists remain openly skeptical of it. But it's worth noting anyway, because it explains something that's easy to miss if you only ever encounter this story through a single grainy home movie from 1967. The idea of a large, hairy, upright hominid living at the edge of human settlement did not begin in California. It is genuinely ancient, and it shows up independently in cultures that never had any contact with one another. Stiesales, Stolo, and other Coast Salish peoples of the Pacific Northwest have oral traditions describing a large, hair-covered forest-dwelling being, often rendered in English as Sasquatch, a name derived from the Halcomelem word Saskets, stretching back long before any European settler ever set foot in that region. Chinese folklore contains centuries-old accounts of the Yeren, a wild, hair-covered man of the mountains. Central Asian traditions describe the Almas. Medieval European art and literature are saturated with depictions of the wild man, a hairy, half-feral human figure that appears in tapestries, church carvings, and heraldry across the continent going back at least to the 12th century. None of these traditions prove that an undiscovered species of great ape has been quietly sharing the planet with modern humans this whole time. What they do prove is that the specific image at the center of this story, an upright, hair-covered, human-like figure moving at the edge of the forest, watching, is one of the oldest and most persistent shared images in the entire human imagination, independently invented or independently observed by cultures that had no way of comparing notes with one another. Which brings us, finally, to a cold, overcast morning on October 20th, 1967, in the far northwest corner of California, along a stretch of the Klamath National Forest known to a small circle of hunters, loggers, and monster enthusiasts as Bluff Creek. Roger Patterson, a former rodeo rider from Yakima, Washington, with a restless streak and a track record of chasing things most of his neighbors found faintly ridiculous, had already self-published a book about the creature he was convinced existed. He had already been on a handful of expeditions looking for it. He had rented an expensive 16mm Kodak K100 camera that he was, by that point, overdue in returning. Overdue enough that there was reportedly an active warrant out for his arrest back in Yakima over an unrelated debt. Riding alongside him that morning was Bob Gimlin, a horse trainer and friend, along for what was, by every account that either man ever gave, an ordinary expedition looking for tracks. What happened next, according to Patterson, unfolded in a matter of seconds. The horses spooked. Patterson was thrown from the saddle. He scrambled up, grabbed the camera, and pointed it at a large, dark, upright figure moving through the creek bed roughly 80 feet away, covered head to foot in dark hair, walking with a wide stride and a low center of gravity, unlike anything either man said they had ever seen a human being do. And then, in the instant that would end up defining 60 years of argument, the figure turned its head and looked directly back at the camera before disappearing into the tree line. The footage that resulted runs just under a minute, roughly 954 individual frames of Kodachrome film, shot at a frame rate Patterson claimed was 24 per second, but which researchers have argued over for decades since because the specific speed matters enormously for calculating the figure's actual stride length and rate of movement. One single frame, numbered 352, showing the creature's over-the-shoulder glance, has become arguably the most closely examined still image in the history of American popular culture, dissected by biomechanics researchers, primatologists, and Hollywood special effects technicians alike. Estimates of the figure's height have ranged from just under 6 feet to well over 7, depending on how researchers calibrate the scale against the surrounding vegetation. The figure appears to have visible breast tissue in some frames, leading to its informal nickname, Patty. And in the decades since, the debate over what exactly that figure is has never come anywhere close to resolving, not because people are simply stubborn, but because the evidence really does sit at an uncomfortable, genuinely contested midpoint between plausible and impossible. On one side of that argument sit a handful of credentialed researchers whose conclusions have never been easy to wave away. Jeff Meldrum, a professor of anatomy and anthropology at Idaho State University, spent decades studying the footage and the physical tracks recovered from the site, some of which measured over 14 inches long with a stride exceeding 4 feet. Meldrum argued that the specific walking pattern visible in the film, a distinctive knee-bending technique known as a compliant gait that reduces the up and down bounce of the head and torso during walking, is not something humans do naturally and would be exceptionally difficult to fake convincingly while wearing a heavy, restrictive costume. He also argued that the depth and pressure distribution recorded in the footprints implied a body weight and a foot anatomy, inconsistent with an ordinary human foot inside an ordinary boot or shoe insert. Meldrum died in late 2025, having spent the better part of 30 years defending the footage's authenticity, a fact that itself became part of the story once the 2026 documentary this topic centers on eventually arrived. Bill Munns, a Hollywood makeup and visual effects specialist with no evident stake in Bigfoot belief when he began his analysis, reached a similar conclusion from an entirely different angle, arguing that the width of the figure's shoulders relative to its waist, along with visible muscle movement beneath the hair in several frames, would have required a level of costume engineering that, in his professional judgment, simply did not exist in 1967. On the other side sits Bob Hieronymus, a man from Yakima who knew Roger Patterson personally and who came forward publicly in 2002 with the claim that he was the man inside the suit, that Patterson had recruited him, paid him a small sum, dressed him in a homemade costume, and coached him on exactly how to walk. Hieronymus has stuck to that story for over 2 decades. He has never produced the actual suit, and no independent physical evidence has ever surfaced to corroborate his account beyond his own testimony, which the believer community has spent years picking apart for inconsistencies, while the skeptic community has largely embraced it as the closing argument in the case. Neither side, notably, has ever produced the one piece of physical evidence that would settle things definitively: a verified suit, verified DNA, verified bones, or an independently witnessed confession signed by every party involved. What existed for 57 years was simply the film itself refusing to resolve. That changed, or at least appeared to change, in March of 2026, when a documentary called Capturing Bigfoot, directed by Mark Evans, a filmmaker previously known for a documentary called The Diamond King, premiered at the South by Southwest Film and TV Festival in Austin. The film's central claim traces back to a locked safe. After the death of Norm Johnson, a film technician who had worked in a Boeing film laboratory during the very years the Patterson-Gimlin footage was shot, and who had personal connections to Patterson and Gimlin through his brother, Johnson's daughter Teresa Brooks, a film instructor at Olympic College, discovered a reel of 60mm film among her father's belongings. She reached out to Evans in June of 2022, and what he found on that reel, once digitized, was a roughly 40-second clip, dated in 1966, a full year before the famous encounter at Bluff Creek, showing a slimmer, less polished figure in what looks like a homemade Bigfoot costume, moving through a wooded setting that closely resembles the location that would become famous the following year. Evans has characterized this footage as a rehearsal, a dry run for the far more famous film that followed. Armed with that discovery, Evans approached Clint Patterson, Roger Patterson's son, who was 12 years old when his father died of cancer in 1972. According to the documentary, Clint revealed that his mother, Patricia, had told him roughly a decade earlier that his father had staged the entire encounter and that the family had earned significant income from licensing the footage over the following decades, money Patricia was unwilling to jeopardize by allowing the truth to come out. Clint alleges that he personally watched his father burn the actual costume in a barrel, piece by piece, which, if true, would explain why no physical suit has ever surfaced across nearly 6 decades of searching. The documentary was well received on the festival circuit, with several outlets describing it as emotionally powerful. Filmmaking, less a forensic expose than a personal story about a son finally speaking a truth his family had spent decades trying to keep buried. Here is where the story genuinely needs to slow down and separate what actually happened from what the documentary claims happened, because the two are not the same thing, and the gap between them is exactly where things stand. as of the middle of 2026. Independent researchers, including the team at the long-running research group Northwest Bigfoot, raised a series of pointed and, frankly, reasonable questions in the weeks following the premiere. The 1966 rehearsal reel, the entire foundation of the documentary's central claim, had not, as of that point, been released for independent examination by any film historian, forensic laboratory, or archival expert outside the production team itself. Nobody had verified the film stock, the processing date, or the chain of custody using any method beyond the recollections of one family. No corroborating documentation, letters, photographs, or third-party records had surfaced linking Norm Johnson to Roger Patterson beyond family memory past, down through his daughter. Critics also pointed out, fairly, that the documentary leans heavily on emotionally compelling personal testimony, particularly Clint Patterson's account of his father's confession and the burning of the costume, rather than on any independently verifiable physical evidence. And Bob Gimlin, the other man present at Bluff Creek that morning, now in his 90s, has said nothing at all in response to the documentary's claims. Not a denial, not a confirmation, just silence, which observers on every side of the debate have interpreted according to their own existing convictions, without anyone actually knowing what it means. By April of 2026, researchers tracking the story noted that no new footage, forensic reports, or independent documentation had been released since the SSW premiere, and that the 1966 reel remained inaccessible to anyone outside the production. By mid-June, the same research group summarized the situation in 3 blunt words: uncertain, unverified, unmoved. The documentary had, in the meantime, also been quietly pulled from at least one other festival's schedule, the Overlook Film Festival, without extensive public explanation. Which is to say, as compelling and, by most accounts, genuinely moving as capturing Bigfoot is as a piece of filmmaking, it has not, at least as of this point in 2026, actually resolved the 60-year argument it claims to close. It has added a dramatic new chapter to a very old, very human story. A father's secret, a mother's silence, a son finally speaking without providing the kind of independently verifiable proof that would let anyone treat the underlying question as settled. And that brings us to the second, considerably murkier layer of this story, the one directly named in the topic that brought you here. The claim that Grok, the AI system developed by XAI, was given the highest resolution scan of the Patterson-Gimlin footage ever produced, and asked to examine frame 3 HPOs for exactly the kind of seam, the line where a mask meets skin, that any sufficiently detailed costume eventually reveals under close enough scrutiny. According to this account, the analysis was run 3 separate times using different digital lighting reconstructions to account for film grain and shadow degradation across 57 years of aging stock, and each time returned the same result: no detectable boundary anywhere on the face, neck, or shoulder. The reported verdict, 4 words, was unidentified biological organism. It's worth being completely straightforward about where that specific claim actually comes from, because it matters enormously to how much weight it deserves. That exact account, down to the specific wording of the alleged verdict, traces back to short-form video content published on channels built around AI-themed content in mid-2026, using framing and language clearly designed to maximize engagement rather than to document a verified scientific process. It has not been reported by any credible technology outlet, any established science publication, or any Bigfoot research organization with a track record of rigorous evaluation. There is no public record of XAI issuing any statement confirming that Grok was tasked with this specific analysis, no published methodology. Describing how the 3 lighting models were constructed, no peer review, and no independent party who has verified that any such analysis actually took place in the form described. That doesn't necessarily mean nobody ever typed a version of this request into an AI chatbot and received an interesting sounding response. Large language models, when asked leading, dramatically framed. Questions about ambiguous images can and do generate confident-sounding, evocative answers that are not the product of rigorous forensic image analysis and are not validated findings simply because they were produced by an AI system rather than a person. A chatbot returning a phrase like unidentified biological organism is not equivalent to a forensic laboratory returning a verified conclusion. And treating the two as interchangeable is exactly the kind of category error that has fueled online misinformation about AI capabilities more broadly throughout 2025 and 2026. So where does that actually leave the underlying mystery, stripped of both the documentary's unverified rehearsal reel and the unverifiable AI analysis claims circulating online? Largely, leaves it exactly where it has sat for nearly 6 decades, genuinely, stubbornly unresolved, for reasons that have very little to do with anyone's gullibility and a great deal to do with the actual limitations of the evidence itself. There is no verified suit, There is no verified creature. There is no DNA sample, no bone, no independent contemporaneous witness beyond the two men who filmed it, and no piece of physical evidence from either side of the debate that has ever survived rigorous, independent, third-party forensic examination. What exists is 59.5 seconds of aging 16mm film, a scattering of large footprints that were never independently authenticated in a laboratory setting at the time, and 60 years of testimony from people with varying, sometimes directly competing, personal and financial interests in how the story gets told. It's worth sitting, honestly, with just how intellectual effort this one short piece of footage has absorbed across 6 decades, because that fact alone says something genuinely interesting about human curiosity, regardless of what the figure in the film actually turns out to be. University. Researchers have published formal analyses of its biomechanics. Anthropologists have staked entire portions of their professional reputations on their conclusions about it, in both directions. Hollywood visual effects professionals have picked apart its technical plausibility, frame by frame. Amateur investigators have spent personal savings traveling to a remote creek in Del Norte County, looking for footprints, hair samples, and any lingering physical trace of whatever moved through those trees on an October morning in 1967. And in September of 2025, the figure's distinctive silhouette, the same wide stride and hunched forward posture visible in frame 352, was formalized into an official Unicode emoji, meaning millions of people who have never heard of Bluff Creek. Bob Hieronymus, or frame 352, now send a stylized version of that exact image in text messages, participating, entirely unknowingly, in one of the longest-running unresolved mysteries in American cultural history. That transformation from disputed evidence into embedded cultural mythology tells you something important about why this particular piece of footage has survived every single debunking attempt thrown at it for close to 60 years without ever fully collapsing into settled consensus on either side. Mythologies don't survive because the people who keep them alive are uniquely credulous. They survive because they sit at a genuinely unresolved intersection between the plausible and the impossible, containing enough real, contested, professionally examined ambiguity that neither side has ever been able to produce the single decisive piece of evidence needed to end the argument outright. It is entirely plausible that 2 men in rural Washington state, working with limited resources and no studio budget, built a costume, scouted a location, and staged one of the most enduring pieces of media in American folk history. It is also true that several credentialed scientists, examining the footage using the tools of their respective disciplines, reached conclusions that a costume of that quality and functional capability would have been extraordinarily difficult to produce using 1967 technology. Both of those things can be honestly, simultaneously true as unresolved possibilities, and the arrival of a documentary, built around an unverified rehearsal reel, followed closely by a viral, unverifiable claim about an AI system's dramatic forward verdict, hasn't actually closed that gap in 2026. It simply added 2 new, equally unresolved threads to a story that has been resisting resolution since long before either Roger Patterson or Grok existed. Threads that echo, whether intentionally or not, the same ancient, cross-cultural fascination with an upright, watchful, hair-covered figure at the edge of the trees that has apparently occupied human imagination for as long as human beings have had forests to be afraid of and curious about in equal measure. What can be said with real confidence, sitting here in the middle of 2026, is this. The footprints Roger Patterson and Bob Gimlin left behind, footage, folklore, court records, festival premieres, forum arguments, and now an unverified AI claim circulating across social media, are real and well documented. What made those footprints in the actual mud of Bluff Creek 59 years ago remains exactly as uncertain now as it was the morning after the horses spooked. Every new piece of purported evidence, a rehearsal reel, nobody outside one production team has examined, a son's painful on-camera testimony that his mother has never publicly confirmed or denied, a viral chatbot verdict with no traceable methodology behind it, adds another layer of story without adding the one thing that would actually settle anything. Independently verified, physically corroborated proof. Until that arrives, if it ever does, the figure in frame 352 will keep doing exactly what it has always done. Turning, glancing back over its shoulder at whoever happens to be watching, and disappearing again into the tree line, precisely the way it did on the morning of October 20th, 1967.